On a summer night, a perfect family shattered in seconds. Betrayal, blood, and lies turned the American dream into a nightmare. A shocking crime brought the town to a standstill. Watch until the end to understand this brutal case. But before we begin, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us. Also, share your opinion about this case in the comments. All of this because, in the picturesque suburb of Oakwood, nestled within the heart of a small Midwestern town, life seemed to unfold like a perfect Norman Rockwell painting. The Thompson family stood as a beacon of the American dream. David Thompson, a charismatic and successful real estate developer, his wife Sarah, a beloved elementary school teacher, and their 10-year-old daughter Emily. Their Tudor-style home, with its manicured lawn and white picket fence, was the envy of the neighborhood. To the outside world, the Thompsons appeared to have it all: financial stability, a strong marriage, and a tight-knit family unit. David Thompson, with his winning smile and sharp business acumen, had quickly climbed the ladder in the local real estate market. His company, Thompson Developments, was responsible for some of the most sought-after properties in the area. Sarah, known for her patience and nurturing nature, was adored by her students and respected by parents and colleagues alike. Their daughter Emily was a bright, cheerful child who excelled in school and participated in various extracurricular activities. The Thompson family's social circle was small but close. Among their closest friends was Michael Anderson, David's best friend since college days. Michael, a bachelor and successful lawyer, was a constant presence in the Thompson household. He was Emily's godfather and often joined the family for dinners, barbecues, and holiday celebrations. To casual observers, Michael seemed like an extension of the Thompson family, trusted, loved, and always welcome. As the summer of 2018 approached, the Thompsons decided to hire a part-time nanny to help with Emily during the school break. Sarah's teaching schedule was lighter, but David's business was booming, requiring more of his time and attention. Through a reputable agency, they found Jessica Moore, a 23-year-old college graduate with glowing references and a warm personality that immediately clicked with Emily. Jessica's arrival seemed to be the final piece that completed the Thompsons' picture-perfect life. She was energetic, responsible, and quickly became a valued member of the household. David and Sarah felt confident leaving Emily in Jessica's capable hands, allowing them to focus on their careers and maintain their active social life. However, beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic existence, currents of discontent and desire were beginning to stir. Sarah Thompson, despite her outward appearance of contentment, had been grappling with a growing sense of emptiness and dissatisfaction in her marriage. The passion that once burned brightly between her and David had dimmed over the years, replaced by routine and familiarity. As Sarah approached her 40th birthday, she found herself increasingly drawn to Michael Anderson. What started as innocent flirtation during family gatherings slowly evolved into lingering glances and accidental touches. Michael, who had always harbored a secret attraction to Sarah, was more than receptive to her subtle advances. Their affair began innocuously enough. A lunch here, a coffee there, always under the guise of friendship and shared history. But soon, stolen moments turned into clandestine meetings, and before long, Sarah and Michael were embroiled in a full-blown affair. They were careful, always mindful of appearances, but the thrill of their secret rendezvous added an excitement to Sarah's life that she hadn't felt in years. David, consumed by his work and trusting in the strength of his marriage, remained oblivious to the growing connection between his wife and his best friend. He attributed Sarah's renewed energy and enthusiasm to the lessened stress of summer break and the help provided by Jessica. Little did he know that the very foundations of his family life were being eroded by betrayal. As the affair progressed, Sarah found herself torn between the comfort and stability of her life with David and the passion and excitement she felt with Michael. She convinced herself that she could maintain both relationships, compartmentalizing her life into neat boxes: devoted wife and mother in one, passionate lover in another. Michael, for his part, struggled with guilt over betraying his best friend. Yet, the depth of his feelings for Sarah overrode his moral qualms. He began to entertain fantasies of a future with Sarah, imagining a life where they could be together openly. The summer wore on, and the web of lies and deceit grew more complex. Sarah and Michael became bolder in their liaisons, taking greater risks to be together. They met in out-of-the-way hotels, took day trips under false pretenses, and exchanged countless text messages and emails. Their infatuation blinded them to the potential consequences of their actions. Jessica, the nanny, unwittingly became a key player in this dangerous game. Her presence in the Thompson home allowed Sarah more freedom to pursue her affair, often using the excuse of running errands or meeting friends to slip away and meet Michael. Jessica's youth and naivety prevented her from noticing anything amiss in the family dynamic. As August approached, bringing with it the promise of cooler weather and the return to routine, Sarah began to feel the weight of her double life. The guilt of deceiving David, the stress of maintaining appearances, and the fear of discovery were taking their toll. She knew that a decision would have to be made, her marriage or her affair, but she continually postponed this reckoning, unable to face the potential fallout. It was on a warm Friday evening in late August when the carefully constructed facade began to crumble. David, having closed a major deal at work, decided to surprise Sarah by coming home early. He stopped by a florist, picking up a bouquet of her favorite lilies, and headed home with a spring in his step, looking forward to a romantic evening with his wife. As David pulled into the driveway, he noticed Michael's car parked a little way down the street. Thinking nothing of it, after all, Michael was a frequent visitor. He entered the house, calling out for Sarah. The silence that greeted him was unusual, but not immediately alarming. Perhaps she was in the backyard, or maybe she had stepped out for a moment. David made his way through the house, the bouquet of lilies still in his hand. As he approached the bedroom, he heard muffled sounds, voices he realized engaged in hushed but intense conversation. One was unmistakably Sarah's. The other, to his growing confusion and dread, was Michael's. For a moment, David stood frozen outside the bedroom door, his mind refusing to process what his instincts were screaming. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he pushed the door open. The scene that greeted him would be forever seared into his memory. Sarah and Michael, partially clothed, scrambling to separate on the bed that David shared with his wife. The next few moments passed in a blur of shouting, accusations, and desperate explanations. David, his face contorted with rage and pain, hurled the bouquet at the guilty couple. Sarah, tears streaming down her face, alternated between pleas for forgiveness and attempts to explain. Michael, shamefaced and silent, could barely meet his best friend's eyes. As the initial shock wore off, David's anger crystallized into a cold, hard fury. He ordered Michael out of the house, warning him never to return. To Sarah, he spat words of disgust and betrayal before storming out himself, unable to bear the sight of her any longer. In the aftermath of the discovery, the Thompson household descended into chaos. Emily, returning home with Jessica from a movie outing, found her mother in tears and her father nowhere to be seen. The young girl, sensing the tension but not understanding its source, became anxious and withdrawn. David spent the night driving aimlessly, his mind a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, grief, and a deep, aching sense of loss. He couldn't fathom how the two people he trusted most in the world could have deceived him so thoroughly. Every happy memory, every moment of intimacy with Sarah, now felt tainted and false. Sarah, left alone in the house with Emily and Jessica, was consumed by remorse and fear. She knew that her actions had likely destroyed her marriage and would forever alter her relationship with her daughter. The excitement and passion of the affair now seemed hollow and meaningless in the face of the pain she had caused. Michael, retreating to his apartment, was overwhelmed by guilt and shame. He had not only betrayed his best friend but had potentially ruined the lives of people he cared about deeply. The future he had imagined with Sarah now seemed like a foolish, selfish fantasy. As dawn broke the next morning, the full weight of the situation began to settle on all involved. David returned home, hollow-eyed and exhausted, to find Sarah waiting for him in the kitchen. Their conversation was tense and painful, filled with recriminations and tearful apologies. Sarah begged for another chance, promising to end things with Michael and dedicate herself to rebuilding their marriage. David, still reeling from the betrayal, was non-committal, unsure if he could ever trust her again. The days that followed were a delicate dance of avoidance and forced civility. For Emily's sake, David and Sarah attempted to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but the strain was evident. Jessica, now aware of the situation, found herself in the uncomfortable position of confidant to both Sarah and Emily, trying to provide support while maintaining professional boundaries. Michael, meanwhile, had become a pariah in their social circle. Friends who had once welcomed him warmly now regarded him with coldness and contempt. His law practice began to suffer as word of his affair spread through the small community. He made several attempts to contact Sarah, but she refused to speak with him, determined to focus on salvaging her marriage. As weeks passed, the Thompson family settled into an uneasy routine. David threw himself into his work, often staying late at the office to avoid confronting the reality of his home life. Sarah, desperate to prove her commitment to the marriage, became almost obsessively attentive to David and Emily's needs. Emily, sensitive to the tension between her parents, became quieter and more withdrawn, her normally bubbly personality subdued. It was during this period of strained reconciliation that the seeds of tragedy were sown. David, unable to shake his feelings of betrayal and anger, began to drink heavily. His behavior became erratic, one moment coldly distant, the next explosively angry. Sarah walked on eggshells, never sure which version of her husband she would encounter. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at work, David returned home in a foul mood. He had been drinking, and the sight of Sarah preparing dinner in the kitchen, a scene of domestic normalcy that now felt like a mockery, pushed him over the edge. The argument that ensued was brutal, with years of pent-up resentments and fresh wounds spilling out in a torrent of accusations and insults. Emily, hearing the shouting from her room, crept downstairs and witnessed her parents' vicious fight. The sight of her father, red-faced and bellowing, and her mother, cowering and tearful, was too much for the young girl to bear. She ran from the house seeking refuge at a neighbor's home. The neighbor, alarmed by Emily's distress, called the police. When officers arrived at the Thompson residence, they found a scene of domestic disarray. Broken dishes on the floor, furniture overturned, and David and Sarah still locked in a heated argument. The police separated the couple, taking statements and assessing the situation. No charges were filed that night, but the incident marked a turning point. The facade of reconciliation had been shattered, revealing the deep, festering wounds beneath. David, sobering up and horrified by his loss of control, agreed to move out temporarily. Sarah, shaken by the violence of the confrontation and deeply concerned for Emily's well-being, began to consider whether the marriage was truly salvageable. In the days that followed, David sought help for his drinking problem, enrolling in an outpatient rehabilitation program. Sarah, encouraged by friends and a therapist, started to explore the possibility of divorce. The idea, once unthinkable, now seemed like the only way forward. As news of the Thompsons' marital troubles spread through the community, Michael Anderson saw an opportunity to reconnect with Sarah. Despite her initial reluctance, Sarah found herself drawn back into communication with Michael. He offered a sympathetic ear and a shoulder to cry on, reminding her of the passion they had shared. David, learning of Sarah's renewed contact with Michael, felt his tenuous grip on sobriety slipping. The progress he had made in therapy seemed meaningless in the face of what he saw as Sarah's continued betrayal. He began to drink again, his thoughts growing darker and more violent with each passing day. The situation came to a head on a chilly October evening. David, having spent the day drinking and brooding, decided to confront Sarah once and for all. He drove to the family home, his mind clouded by alcohol and rage. Sarah, alone in the house with Emily asleep upstairs, was startled by David's sudden, aggressive entrance. What transpired next would shock the community and forever alter the lives of all involved. In an alcohol-fueled rage, David attacked Sarah, his fists flying as years of pent-up anger and betrayal exploded in a moment of uncontrolled violence. Sarah, caught off guard and terrified, fought back desperately, managing to break free and run towards the kitchen. In the struggle that ensued, Sarah grabbed a kitchen knife, brandishing it in self-defense. David, beyond reason and blinded by fury, lunged at her. In a tragic twist of fate, he impaled himself on the knife, the blade piercing his heart. Sarah watched in horror as David collapsed, blood pooling rapidly on the kitchen floor. Panicked and in shock, Sarah's first instinct was to call Michael. He arrived at the house before the authorities, finding Sarah hysterical and David's lifeless body on the kitchen floor. In a moment of misguided loyalty and love, Michael made a fateful decision. He would help Sarah cover up David's death, making it appear as if he had never been there that night. Working quickly, Michael helped Sarah clean up the scene, disposing of evidence and concocting a story of David's drunken accident. They agreed that Sarah would wait until morning to discover David's body, giving them time to ensure their story was consistent and believable. The next morning, Sarah's anguished calls to emergency services seemed genuine to the responding officers. She claimed to have found David at the foot of the stairs, speculating that he must have fallen in a drunken stupor. The initial investigation seemed to support this theory, given David's known struggles with alcohol. However, as days passed and the investigation deepened, inconsistencies began to emerge. Forensic evidence didn't quite match Sarah's story, and neighbors reported hearing sounds of an argument on the night in question. Detectives, initially sympathetic to Sarah as a possible victim of domestic abuse, started to view her with increasing suspicion. As pressure mounted, the fragile alliance between Sarah and Michael began to crack. Sarah, racked with guilt and fear, considered confessing the truth. Michael, terrified of the consequences, urged her to maintain their fabricated story. Their conflicting desires created a rift between them, straining the relationship that had once seemed worth any risk. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Emily, traumatized by the loss of her father and the strange behavior of her mother, confided in her school counselor. The young girl's recollection of the sounds she heard that night, and her memory of Michael's car outside the house, provided crucial leads for the detectives. With the net closing in, Sarah made a decision that would seal her fate. Overwhelmed by guilt and unable to continue living with the lie, she confessed to the detectives, revealing the truth about the fatal confrontation with David and Michael's role in the cover-up. The arrest of Sarah Thompson and Michael Anderson sent shockwaves through the community. The story of love, betrayal, and deadly violence captivated local and national media, turning the once idyllic suburb into the center of a sensational true crime story. As the case moved to trial, the prosecution painted a picture of a calculated affair that spiraled into violence and deception. Sarah's defense team argued for leniency, citing years of emotional abuse and the heat of the moment nature of David's death. Michael, facing charges of accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice, found his once promising legal career in tatters. The trial was a media circus, with every sordid detail of the Thompsons' marital troubles and Sarah's affair with Michael laid bare for public consumption. Former friends and neighbors testified, some sympathetic to Sarah's plight, others condemning her actions. Emily, still struggling to process the loss of her father and the betrayal of her mother, was spared the ordeal of testifying, but her absence in the courtroom spoke volumes. After weeks of emotional testimony and intense legal arguments, the jury reached a verdict. Sarah was found guilty of manslaughter, with the judge acknowledging the complex circumstances surrounding David's death. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 10 years. Michael, convicted on all charges, received a 5-year sentence for his role in covering up the crime. As Sarah was led away from the courtroom, her eyes met Emily's one last time. The look they shared was one of profound sadness and loss, a recognition of the irreparable damage done to their family and the long road of healing that lay ahead. The aftermath of the trial left the community reeling. The Thompson house, once a symbol of suburban success, stood empty and neglected, a silent reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Emily, now in the care of her maternal grandparents, faced years of therapy and emotional recovery. The case of Sarah Thompson and Michael Anderson became a cautionary tale, dissected by true crime enthusiasts and social commentators alike. It sparked discussions about the hidden pressures of seemingly perfect marriages, the destructive power of infidelity, and the thin line between passion and violence. As Sarah began her sentence at the state correctional facility, she found herself grappling with the consequences of her actions. The once respected teacher and devoted mother now wore a prison uniform, her days structured by strict routines and surrounded by high walls. In the quiet moments of her cell, Sarah often reflected on the series of choices that led her to this point, wondering how she could have allowed her life to unravel so dramatically. Michael, serving his sentence in a minimum security prison, faced a different kind of punishment. His reputation in tatters, his legal career destroyed, he was left to contemplate the cost of his betrayal. The passion he had felt for Sarah now seemed a distant memory, overshadowed by the reality of his current circumstances. Back in Oakwood, the community struggled to come to terms with the tragedy. Neighbors who had once envied the Thompsons now spoke of them in hushed tones, their story a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. The local schools, where both Sarah and Emily had been well-known figures, implemented new programs to help students deal with family trauma and to recognize signs of domestic trouble. Emily, now living with her grandparents in a neighboring town, faced the daunting task of rebuilding her life without either of her parents. The young girl, once vivacious and outgoing, had become quiet and introspective. Her grandparents, determined to provide her with stability and love, enrolled her in intensive therapy and worked tirelessly to create a nurturing environment. As months turned into years, the story of the Thompsons began to fade from the headlines, but its impact lingered. True crime documentaries and books explored the case, each offering their own interpretation of the events that led to that fateful night. Some portrayed Sarah as a victim of circumstance, driven to desperate acts by an abusive relationship. Others painted her as a calculating adulteress who chose passion over family. The truth, as is often the case, lay somewhere in the complex middle ground. 5 years into her sentence, Sarah had become a model prisoner. She threw herself into educational programs, counseling sessions, and prison work assignments, determined to make something positive out of her time behind bars. She maintained limited contact with Emily through supervised letters and occasional phone calls, always careful to respect her daughter's boundaries and the advice of Emily's therapists. Michael, released after serving his full 5-year sentence, emerged from prison a changed man. The charismatic lawyer was gone, replaced by a somber, introspective individual, struggling to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. He attempted to rebuild his life in a different state, away from the notoriety of the case, but found that the shadow of his past followed him wherever he went. As Emily entered her teenage years, she began to ask more questions about her parents and the events that tore her family apart. With the help of her therapist and the unwavering support of her grandparents, she slowly began to process her trauma. She started to understand that her parents were flawed individuals who had made terrible mistakes. But this understanding came with its own kind of pain. 10 years after the tragic night that changed everything, Sarah became eligible for parole. The parole hearing was a media event, with journalists and true crime aficionados eager to catch a glimpse of the woman whose story had captivated the nation a decade earlier. Sarah, her hair now streaked with gray and her face lined with the weight of her experiences, spoke eloquently of her remorse, her journey of self-reflection, and her hope for a chance at redemption. The parole board, after careful consideration, granted Sarah's release, citing her exemplary behavior in prison and her commitment to rehabilitation. The decision was met with mixed reactions in Oakwood and beyond. Some felt that justice had been served and that Sarah deserved a second chance. Others believed that no amount of time could atone for the destruction of a family and the loss of a life. Sarah's release brought a new set of challenges. Now in her early 50s, she faced the daunting task of rebuilding her life from scratch. Finding employment with a criminal record proved difficult, and the notoriety of her case followed her wherever she went. She settled in a small apartment in a city far from Oakwood, taking a job at a local community center where her past was known but not judged. The most significant challenge, however, was reconnecting with Emily. Now a young woman of 20, Emily had spent half her life without her parents. The process of rebuilding their relationship was slow and fraught with emotional landmines. Initial meetings were supervised and tense, with years of unspoken pain and resentment hanging between them. As mother and daughter cautiously navigated their new reality, they found unexpected moments of connection. Emily, studying psychology in college, began to view her mother's actions through a more nuanced lens. Sarah, humbled by her experiences and desperate to make amends, approached each interaction with patience and understanding. Michael, meanwhile, had retreated from public life entirely. He lived a solitary existence, working odd jobs and avoiding any reminders of his past life. The affair that had once seemed so vital and passionate now felt like a distant dream, overshadowed by the catastrophic consequences it had wrought. In Oakwood, life had moved on, but the echoes of the Thompson tragedy lingered. The house where it all happened had finally been sold, renovated, and occupied by a new family unconnected to its dark history. Yet longtime residents couldn't help but glance at the property with a mix of sadness and morbid curiosity, remembering the family that had once seemed to have it all. As the years passed, the story of Sarah, David, and Michael became something of a local legend, a cautionary tale passed down to new generations. It served as a reminder of the fragility of trust, the destructive power of secrets, and the far-reaching consequences of momentary passions. 15 years after the night that changed everything, Emily, now a practicing therapist specializing in family trauma, made a decision that would bring the story full circle. She chose to write a book about her experiences, hoping to help others who had lived through similar family tragedies. The process of writing forced her to confront long-buried emotions and to reach out to both Sarah and Michael for their perspectives. The book, when published, reignited interest in the case. It offered a unique and deeply personal view of the events, seen through the eyes of the child caught in the middle. Emily's account was raw and honest, detailing the pain of losing her father, the confusion and anger towards her mother, and the long, difficult journey of healing and understanding. Sarah, now working as a counselor for domestic violence survivors, saw the book as both a painful reminder of her past mistakes and a testament to her daughter's resilience. She supported Emily's decision to tell their story, hoping that it might serve as a warning to others contemplating infidelity or struggling in abusive relationships. Michael, initially reluctant to revisit the past, eventually agreed to contribute his perspective to Emily's book. His chapters were a study in remorse and self-reflection, offering insight into how a moment of weakness can spiral into life-altering consequences. The publication of Emily's book brought a sense of closure to many in Oakwood who had been touched by the tragedy. It sparked renewed discussions about mental health, the importance of communication in relationships, and the long-term effects of trauma on families. For Sarah, Michael, and Emily, the book represented a final chapter in their shared story. While they could never undo the events of the past, they had each, in their own way, found a path forward. Their lives, forever altered by one night of passion and violence, stood as a powerful reminder of the complex nature of human relationships and the enduring impact of our choices. As the 20th anniversary of David's death approached, Oakwood prepared for a memorial service. The event, organized by Emily, was not just a remembrance of her father but a celebration of healing and forgiveness. Sarah and Michael, though no longer part of each other's lives, both attended, their presence a testament to the long and difficult journey they had all undertaken. The service, held in the local park where the Thompsons had once enjoyed family picnics, drew a large crowd. Old neighbors, former colleagues, and even some of the detectives who had worked on the case gathered to pay their respects. Emily, standing before the assembled group, spoke eloquently of loss, redemption, and the power of forgiveness. As the sun set on Oakwood that evening, casting long shadows across the park, there was a sense of a chapter closing. The Thompson tragedy, which had once defined the community, had evolved into a story of resilience and healing. It served as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of light, of understanding, and of moving forward. The legacy of that fateful night would continue to ripple through the lives of all those touched by it. For Sarah, it was a daily reminder of the cost of her choices and the ongoing work of redemption. For Michael, it was a cautionary tale of how quickly passion can turn to ashes. And for Emily, it was the crucible that had forged her into the person she had become. A healer, a storyteller, and a bridge between past and future. As the community of Oakwood looked to the future, the story of the Thompsons remained a part of its fabric, a complex tapestry of love, betrayal, violence, and ultimately, hope. It stood as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of forgiveness, even in the face of unimaginable tragedy.